so similar to like the mafioso or gangs, because they always say, well, it's not the individual acts that matter, it's the culture that was sick. And then along with trading these mortgages, you can trade those insurance policies I talked about, a credit default swap. Essentially, if that person forecloses on that home, you get your money. And the bank gets the monthly fees that you paid to have that insurance premium. Like I pay my car insurance monthly, so they get money every month. If I never get in a car accident, I never have to pay it. That's money in the bank's bank. And then they can trade these insurance policies. They can trade it to people. This is also over the counter, so also very, and then they can trade it to more people. And then they can essentially phrase it the same way, that this is a box that's constantly going to fill with money. But if one person defaults, then the hundreds of investors that went down, that's called the securitization food chain, the way that goes through the entire world financial market. If the person who is putting the money in this box defaults, and they can't pay into it anymore, and the bank can't pay the insurance, then that money that everyone thought was there completely evaporates. The credit default swap market at its peak, 2007, 2008, was worth $45 trillion, which is roughly twice the value of the entire New York Stock Exchange. To give you an idea of how widespread this was, how vast the problem it was. And I found this chain of command of investors, of people buying into this box and buying into the premium rates. A lot like a process called subfeudization, which is essentially, if you're a noble in feudal England and you're given land, then you can rent that land. And then they can rent that, and they can rent that. And if one person screws up on rent payments, it goes down the entire lot, and everyone loses. Except, of course, in this scenario, the people who buy these insurance policies. And that was the major problem. And since no one was watching, there's so much room for them to do whatever is a short-term gain. The first biggest rule in investing is buy low, sell high. The second is risk equals reward. The higher risk, the more reward you're going to get. This is the idea of penny stocks. You buy $400 worth of penny stocks in some pharmaceutical company that no one's ever heard of. You're either going to have a very large gain if that company succeeds, if they make some medication that soars off, or in some illness that passes on very quickly. And with the securitization market, the risk was enormous, as we found out when it collapsed. When we realized that there was no money in these boxes that people were selling to each other to make more money. But they walk away with the asking price. And then where does that leave the homeowner? They're essentially a toy in that game. And that goes back to the people who said they own land. That you're essentially, your livelihood, your home, is being bought and sold. They're betting on your failure. And the only real regulation wasn't from the government, it was from these rating companies. That will rate this box and say, oh, this is a AAA rating. We learned a lot about this in August because the countries are rated the same way, people are rated the same way. All of us have a credit score, whether we know it or not, or whether we use it or not. And the fault in this, and this goes back again to how I said it was libertarian, how the free market makes so much sense. Well, people just want profit. And anything that decreases profit, they're not going to go after. A company like AIG, or ABE, I think they're called now, or TLC or whatever they're called, they get a higher price, or a higher fee, the higher they rate it. So it is to their advantage, it is to their complete incentive to ignore any problems they may see with the mortgage. That maybe this person had their bankruptcy before, or maybe they had defaulted on a house before. There was a new story just last month, actually, that got extremely little attention. Our best friend, Bank of America, had to drop $335 million in a settlement suit. Because what they were doing was forcing minority buyers into a subprime mortgage. Let me explain what I mean by subprime. It essentially means that the interest rate is going to be higher. It essentially means that it's going to take longer to pay off. So, if you were black or Hispanic, and you went to Bank of America, even if you qualify for a prime mortgage on a low interest rate, they would force you into a subprime mortgage on a higher interest rate. Again, because it's about short-term gain. And this kind of thing was everywhere. Like I said, everyone that was involved said it was a cultural problem, that it wasn't just several people here and there. And again, expanded on trillions and trillions of dollars. I'd never heard of the Glass-Steagall Act until I read the Declaration of the Occupation of New York City. And that was, it's like the second or third thing on the list. The reinforcement of the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was passed in 1934. It was packaged along with a lot of other new deal legislation. And the idea was to separate the banks, the commercial banks, a bank where you just put savings in, like I have a savings account with PNC, and the investor banks, like Lehman Brothers, like Bear Stearns. Two companies that I'm fairly certain I had never heard of, and that most people also had never heard of until they failed, and we realized how enormously important they were. And that was almost the beauty of the 2008 financial crisis. That we got to see the power structure so plainly. And it's sad that we didn't get to see it until it collapsed. That's another thing actually due to the Occupying and how much of it is about awareness, about just how the world works. Glass-Steagall, sorry. But in 1980, the provision that these commercial banks and these investment banks could not meet together or merge was repealed. Then in 1988, the idea that they couldn't invest in derivatives without people watching also repealed. And we look at about 30 years pretty much, from about 1980 up until, actually just 1980 up until about 2000. You see government regulators pulling out of the mortgage market, pulling out and keeping an eye on these banks. And really, another great tenet right here from occupiers is follow the money. And how are we going to ignore a $45 trillion market when I can turn on CNBC right now and watch the $20 trillion in the New York Stock Exchange scroll down the bottom? And I used to think that the system was merely ill, that it could